All right, good evening. I have my first guest, or my only guest this evening, Nick Mamatas, who is an amazing science fiction and horror author and editor, also a mystery writer. I don't want to
Mhm.
leave that out. And what we're gonna do with Nick is we're gonna talk about his odyssey as a writer, as well as some common themes, and talk about some of the books, both nonfiction and fiction, that he's written. And a lot of it really informs, A, his worldview, and then B, kind of how he's managed his writing career. He really lives by some of the books and advice that he's given. So with that, Nick, first question out of the gate. What sorts of things do you write, and why?
I write a little of everything, although these days more fiction. I started off as a journalist in the late 90s when it was still possible to get 50 cents a word for not even a huge magazine, or $1 a word for a business magazine, or $500 for 1,200 words for the Village Voice or different alternative weekly newspapers. Then, of course, came the dot-com boom,
Mm-hmm.
an incredible increase in the amount of content, followed immediately by the dot-com bust, followed 6 months later by 9/11.
Well,
That was like a 1, 2, 3 punch combo. Mm-hmm.
and the other thing that actually bears mentioning, that if you go even before that, you grew up on Long Island, right?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
and
And
it
Brooklyn and
was
Long Island. Yeah.
Brooklyn and Long Island, and it was in the shadow of kind of the end of the Cold War. There was like a massive defense industry there, and you
Mm-hmm.
kind of lived through some of that too. So I'm assuming that was some of the influence in your writing and things like that. But with that kind of as a stage, if you
Mm-hmm.
actually want to say more about that, would be,
Sure.
yeah, yeah. So like growing up, and talk a little bit about that and how it informs, at least your subsequent writing career as a setup.
Well, it made college very annoying because I actually went to college in 1989.
Hmm.
Political science was one of my three concentrations. And the first thing that happened was I went to Poly 101, and he said, well, here's our syllabus, here's our textbook. By the way, you can throw the textbook away. It's all over because the Berlin Wall had been coming down over the summer.
Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, even if not that, it was all based around Cold War politics.
Yep.
And from a book that was published in 1987, where it seemed like it was going to go on for a long time. The second thing that happened was, as you alluded to, the peace dividend, so-called peace dividend, because a lot of the contractors on Long Island, like Grumman, Northport, and Lockheed, and things like that, started having some cuts. So all the very annoying Republicans on Long Island who had sent their kids to BU and Dartmouth realized they could no longer afford BU and Dartmouth.
Mm-hmm.
So they all came back to Long Island to go to SUNY Stony Brook, which is a state university. And all these kids were very interested in, like, oh, the tax and spend Democrats, we have to destroy this university. So even though they're benefiting from it,
Right.
their whole thing, they took over the newspaper, they had all these weird rallies, all the usual kind of fill in the blank review shenanigans that they learned at Dartmouth and at BU. They were doing the same kind of thing there. And of course, many of them were political science majors, still want to be lawyers. Because back in 1989, before computing, destroyed the legal industry, being a lawyer was like a good idea if you weren't too bright enough to be a doctor.
Right.
So I think I taking a lot of classes with these guys and having a lot of political arguments with them and a lot of back and forth. And also, there's a lot of other things going on campus, like any campus has all sorts of political things going on. There was like a boycott of Coca-Cola over apartheid,
Mm-hmm.
and the right-wing response was, well, the ANC are communists, or the ANC are violent, etc. And so 4 years of that really sharpened arguments, changed arguments for me politically, and also at the same time, I found the internet. Before the web, it was Tiny Muds and Telnet and FTP and IRC. And like, oh, this is going to change everything. I'll never have to make a phone call again, which back in those days, you would have to call magazines and pitch them.
Right.
You wouldn't write them a letter or an email. You would have to say, oh, hi, is Bill there? Hi, Bill, I've got this idea for an article of 1,200 words. And had I grown up 10 years earlier, I would not have been a writer. There's no way I'd be able to call somebody on the phone and pitch them an idea and have them not hang up on me in 2 seconds. Like, this stammering asshole, who's this fucking guy? Click. But with an email, that was my lily pad to actually becoming a writer.
Now, and I think we'll get into this probably likely in a later segment, but you still consider yourself a communist, right?
Anarcho-communist.
Okay, but you've stuck. I mean, you stuck with. Were you kind of interested in that before you went to college? Did college kind of? So
No.
when the fall of the Berlin Wall happened, how did you? Because the one thing I admire about you is you've stuck with the philosophy, even with the fall of communism and things like that. So how was that in terms of kind of dealing with the argumentation and particularly in that time when it was the end of history?
I was all for the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I was never a Stalinist.
Mm-hmm.
I was always interested in what they call socialism from below.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a trend that's not just people say, oh, well, after that fell apart, of course you're going to say this, but that was a trend from the 19th century, socialism from below, and it was the great Socialist Party of Eugene Debs split over the Russian Revolution. Was it good or was it bad? So even from the very beginning, this question was huge inside the left. And basically about how to organize the economy, whether you do it democratically or you do it via planning. And how can it be democratic without being a market? Or with a kind of shadow market. So my main interest has always been, how do you plan an economy? How do you, because and the other issues about nation state and things like that were much less interesting to me.
Okay, so
has its own things where, well, we'll just have big chore wheels and we'll spin the chore wheel and see what. And I also think that's a bad idea.
Yeah. Okay, so which is actually interesting, and we'll talk about it in the second segment. Is the world in terms of the art, like making that possible? Back in the 80s, it was a little bit harder. It would have been a little bit harder to realize because but now with the advent of the internet and things like that, that sort of bottoms up, communism.
Mm-hmm.
The technology is possible for that. But let's I just want to set the stage for everybody, and we can talk through that later. Okay, so it's kind of the late 80s. The internet is in full bloom, and 9/11 happens. Then what?
Well, then writing falls apart. Journalism falls apart. I mean, I know people who've lost 90% of their income. On September 12th, I had several pieces out, checks owed to me, and people somehow found the will while the towers were still burning. I was living in Jersey City, right across the river. Wreckage from the offices, like little burning pieces of paper, came onto my stoop.
Oh, wow.
So I spent 9/11, sweeping it off and putting out little fires and going down to the river to see it collapse and that kind of thing. And like everyone else, things were closed. We couldn't leave Jersey. The path was closed. The path was actually destroyed. Part of it was. So we couldn't go to New York. It took a few days for us to get there to help out, down by Canal Street, bringing dog food for the corpse sniffing dogs, things like that. People who gave blood, and of course also beginning anti-war rallies immediately, because the idea about who should we go to war with was not Saudi Arabia. It was our old. Well, we have these plans already about Iraq, and of course Afghanistan was a major target. And even inside the anti-war movement, there was a lot of people saying, we're actually pro-war. Like their slogan was "Justice, not vengeance," which is a pro-war sentiment.
Right.
It just means can we pick the war instead of you, Mr. Bush, picking the war? And as it turns out, no, Mr. Bush picked the war. But after 9/11 on 9/12, I got a lot of emails saying, "Oh, guess what? Your check and all our checks from the advertisers, they were in the Tower 5. I guess they're all gone. We're going out of business. Bye." And that happened to a lot of magazines.
Oh my God.
Many of them were already suffering. I mean, there was one magazine I wrote for quite frequently called Artbyte, BYTE. It was an internet cyber culture thing. And they had gone through 3 editors and were doing a lot of changes. So clearly they were going to collapse sooner or later. And 9/12 was like a great idea. Oh, sorry. All our money just burned up. Bye. And that was very common. And I made no money writing for magazines for like 9 months before I found like a $200 gig writing for some new webzine. And of course, the webzines that were coming out like Salon.com and Slate. You were paying, if you discovered life on Mars. Oh, life on Mars, really? $400. And lesser than that, like $200, that kind of thing. So it was really rough all around. And then I've been writing fiction for a little while, but then I thought to myself, you know what, I might as well write fiction. Because it's not commercial.
So that's when you started writing fiction. You didn't do it in college or?
No, I was more interested in like the essay and journalism,
Okay.
and I dabbled in some fiction. I liked fiction. I tried to write a play. I tried to write little stories here and there. But there was always this idea like, oh, I'll write for the newspapers and the essays, and then occasionally write fiction, which for many years is how writing a record worked. Every writer had, oh, you've written 7 novels. Well, how do you keep busy? Well, I write for newspapers all the time. I write these personal essays all the time. Or I write, book reviews for fancy magazines. Or pot-boiling just service journalism. So every writer of the 20th century who you can name who wasn't a mega seller was always doing that. But that became impossible in the early 21st century.
Okay, so
one might as well write fiction.
So you're coming out of, post 9/11, there's no checks to go around. You have the kind of the nascent internet. Well, actually, the market, the bubble collapsed then too, right?
Yeah, so if you put money in beans.com, all your beans were gone. If you're a child out there watching this for some reason, beans is like Bitcoin, but even worse.
Well, they also had I remember like pets.com and they all went
there. They had web TV. We could watch their own little TV shows on the web. And back when it was almost impossible to watch television on the web because it was just extremely slow. People were still having 56K modems and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of cases like that where they even like Apple had a the Pilot, or didn't they have like the Pilot or something like that? And it was a complete
Palm Pilot. That's right.
Palm Pilot. Yeah. So it was a complete failure. But
remember the Newton? It was also a kind of a notepad. That was $500 notepad. Yeah.
Okay, so you're in this environment. There's some internet companies that are still around or starting, like Salon.com, that are paying something. What do you do to kind of bridge the gap there? And this is, I'm guessing, this is the genesis of your book, which is now out of print officially.
That's right.
Starve Better.
Starve Better, out of print as of yesterday morning. So Starve Better is a collection of essays and old blog posts and some new material from 2011 where I discuss how to write short subjects to get money fast. Because I've always been frustrated by writing books and say, oh, well, first you got to sit down and write your novel. Well, that'll take a year, 2 years, 3 years. Then find an agent, that's a year, 2 years, 3 years. Then it'll come out and you get your $5,000. But what if I need $50?
Mm-hmm. And they might not even buy your novel. And they might not even buy
That's right. You can write a second novel. I mean, my first novel didn't get published. I have friends of mine, whose first novel is their 4th novel or 5th novel or 9th novel. So I wanted to focus on short subjects, basically short essays and feature reporting for the second tier of magazines, not Vanity Fair or the New Yorker, but anything from small men's magazines to the weekly papers I was writing for, to writing features for fiction magazines, like interviewing science fiction writers, kind of like this, except written down. And the other half was about writing short fiction, primarily science fiction, fantasy, and horror, because that's what pays. At the time, in 2001, 3 cents a word was professional rate. Now we're up to 20 years later, 8 cents a word. And it's not because science fiction has become more popular, but because it's not commercial. Right? And when someone pays 8 cents a word, it's not because they're making money to pay 8 cents a word, it's because they want to be loved by fans and by writers. And you get love by giving writers money, and then they love you. So because it's not commercial, it is not as prone to the vagaries of the economy.
And when you say it's not as when you say it's not as commercial, what do you mean by that?
Well, look at major magazines like Apex or Clark's World. They're like a cottage industry. They're like not quite a hobby. They make some money doing it, but no one's pulling down the money that somebody who works at Esquire magazine makes.
Yeah.
Or even somebody who works at like Iguana World monthly for the Iguana fan is making. So it is their avocation. And major magazines like Asimov's and Analog that have full-time staff have full-time staff because Penny Press also does Sudoku and astrology and word find.
Right.
And the 4 magazines they have, the 2 science fiction magazines, the mystery magazines, are basically cross-subsidized because they're all printed in the same time at the same place. They use the same office, and because the owner of Penny Press has an affection for the pulps.
Okay, so you start writing for science fiction magazines.
Yes.
And what was your first? As you went through the process, how many? I don't. You probably don't remember this. I'm asking for data, but I want to try and make sure it's not super specific. But how long did it take for you to make your first sale? I know
exactly how long it took. It's been a nightmare. It was 2 years. 2 years. Is that quite right? Actually, it's not quite. Well, let's see. I really started submitting in 1997 fiction, and I started publishing nonfiction in 1998. My first publication of fiction was a short story in Tailbones, a now defunct print magazine, but the publisher Fairwood Press still exists. And it was my 13th story. The first 12 were basically me learning how to teach myself how to write. The 13th story was the story that only I could write. It was about Andy Warhol's dictum that in the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I made it literally true. So we follow somebody who's been famous 15 minutes over his period of time. 1,800 words. I got $18 for it.
That's penny a word.
Yeah, penny a word.
That's still the semi-pro rate, right?
Yeah, $18, man. And my roommate was like, "What are you talking about? Didn't you get $500 last week from the Village Voice?" Yeah, but this is fiction. It's much more difficult, and it is much more difficult to publish fiction than nonfiction.
In your opinion, why is that? I mean, I have a theory, but
well, there are 2 reasons. One, you don't need to be a writer to write nonfiction. That is, if you can be a subject matter expert, mm-hmm. and they'll work with you to make your expertise readable. So that's one level on which nonfiction is easier to write. Even if you were a journalist, you just hand them the material. You hand them the quotes, you hand them this, and there's no preciousness about it. If you hand them a 5,000-word piece and they have a room for 300 words, they're cutting from the bottom, and the first 300 words are what's going up there. Mm-hmm. So that makes it easier. Also, there's people want to read nonfiction. People want to read about sports. They want to read the news. They want to read about features. They want to read ideas. And fiction, especially short fiction, is not a pursuit that 1 million people want in this country. Maybe there are 250,000 people who are really interested in short fiction. And of course, of those, some segment of them like science fiction, some segment of them like the New Yorker style fiction. Some of them are really nuts and love literary journals that are backed by universities. So between being 10 times easier to write and 10 times easier to sell, nonfiction pays 50 cents a word instead of half a cent a word.
Right.
Or at least back before the internet made everyone a nonfiction author.
Right.
Every tweet's a press release. Every Facebook post is a feature report, that kind of thing.
So that dictum is kind of Andy Warhol is converging toward the truth, right?
Exactly. So then it took me about another year to sell a second story. Then the third story was published right away. Then the fourth story, then a men's magazine in which I published nonfiction, I saw had published a piece of fiction. It was called Razor. At the time, you might remember lad mags like Stuff and Maxim, which had almost no copy. It was all like, Tara Reid looking cute, and then a pie graph, and then, hey, dudes, here's how you shave, and like a picture of a razor and that kind of thing. Then there were things like GQ and Esquire, which were had reporters like the Norman Mailer kind of business, right. And Razor was in the middle. He said, "Oh, not as stupid as these magazines, but we can't afford to be these magazines, so we're in the middle." And I wrote a bunch of stuff for them about movies and some political stuff and things like that. Then I saw that they'd published a story from a guy in prison. I said, "Well, I'll send them a story too," and they published a story. And they gave me $1,000. And they apologized for giving me $1,000.
Which story was that?
There were 2 stories that I published. What was the first story? The first story is called The Armory Show, which was about now taking place in the past of 2017, and the 100th anniversary of the famous Armory Show of 1917, which introduced Dada to America. And it's basically about a guy who commits a mass murder as his art, and an art critic stopping him. using her critical power and her fighting ability.
And then was
$1,000 bucks.
and so $1,000 for that one, or is it two that you sold?
And I sold the second one as well, which is also another $1,000.
Oh wow!
And they apologized because it wasn't the going rate. The going rate for words in Razor magazine was 50 cents a word. But fiction, because it wasn't as popular, they said, "Oh, we just have a flat rate of $1,000. Sorry." Which you can do when you had half your pages are glossy ads, and your magazine was $5, and you had a circulation of 500,000. That's totally a reasonable price.
So what happened to Razor and Maxim and all that? The internet killed
Razor, well, interestingly enough, I had pitched some other things to Razor. There's another story going in there a couple of years later. I didn't have a long relationship with them. I published maybe 7 pieces with them, in addition to the 2 stories, so like 9 pieces altogether. And another editor came in, and she's so excited, like, "Oh, we're going to work out. I'm going to go to the meeting right now, pitch these ideas." Never heard from them again. Then I see in the news or the internet that Razor shut down that day. So that meeting she was going to was the meeting where she was getting fired. And they're all getting fired. Yeah. And that happens a lot in publishing. Like, "Oh, we're going to this meeting. We're going to talk about your book. We're going to talk about your future as a writer." And they never get back to you because the email shuts down right away. And then 2 weeks later, you hear from them on social media, or you hear news. "Yeah, I'm back at my mom's house. Got a job at the pet shop."
Do these people ever come? Do these people ever come back, or once that happens, they're done?
They come back.
Okay.
Sometimes they come back in weird ways, but they come back. And it's true of fiction too. I know a lot of people who wrote a lot of fiction, and then they sort of lose track of fiction, or don't care about it, or hit some limit, or they get upset about it. But these are writing skills, and now they're working for Yelp. Or they're writing memoirs, or they're writing other things. An acquaintance of mine was a horror writer in the early 2000s, and I saw him around in Jersey and New York, and he's a nice guy. And now he writes for environmental magazines. And he has a heart-rending column about species that are endangered and going extinct. And it's really difficult. Like, "Oh, here's another one. There's another bird I'm never going to see again." It's a hard beat to be a writer for, I imagine.
Oh, he obviously enjoys it for some twisted reason.
Well, it pays, and he's helping people. He's helping the world, he thinks. And of course, sometimes there's good news. "Oh, we found one more fish. It was not extinct. All right, whew." That happens occasionally.
So, throughout all this, where does the term paper artist kind of come? Like, when did you discover that opportunity?
In the newspaper.
Well, first of all, just explain what I'm talking about.
I will, sure. So I wrote term papers for a living for quite a long time. I bought a house with term paper money in Jersey City.
Oh my God!
So right by Manhattan, the house that I was living in 9/11 was a term paper house.
So how, like,
the subprime mortgage where anybody, "Oh, are you alive? Here's your mortgage. Enjoy." So it wasn't that difficult.
So how much would students pay? How much would students pay for like various term papers?
Well, they would pay $20 to $30 a page, but I would get $10 a page, and of course the capitalists would get $10 a page. And
so there was an organized company that did this?
There's a whole network of organized companies that do this, like Complete and that kind of thing. And that's how I found my first job. My first job was the newspaper, Writers Wanted. Much like politics, economics, and literature. Oh, I like those things. And I applied, and it was a guy running a term paper mill out of Jersey City, which he planted halfway between Boston and DC to get all the colleges. And I'd have to print out papers and go there every couple of days, give him 3 copies, one for the student, one for his files, and one for no other purpose. And there was a kind of a waiver saying I'm not handing in this paper. That's just a model for me to look at, and who knows? Well, sometimes you do know, because, like I said, I was an anarcho-communist, and when there was an economics paper, I'm like, "Oh, as Marx says in Capital Volume 2, just throw that in there, see if the professor's reading,
Okay. So you put your fingerprints on a little bit so that you can track.
Yeah. I remember one time my first novel, Move Underground, came out in 2004, and some kid said, "You can write about any novel you want." I'm like, "Oh, great!" So I wrote about Move Underground, and he even complained to the broker saying that, one, I got 2 word comments about this. It's like, the first comment from the person was, "What the hell is this?" And 2, "I don't think you understood the book."
Oh my God. Yeah. So what happened if somebody got like, was there some sort of guarantee that you'll get like a B or better on these things, or?
No guarantee. This is the model paper.
Oh yeah. Okay.
People would complain anyway, but of course these are the people who buy term papers from the newspaper. So they're complaining types, to be honest with you.
Right.
They're the type that complain. Although I will say, and I talked about this in the Term Paper Artist, the famous essay, famous because we printed a bunch of times.
In what book? In what book?
Currently, you can get it in the Planet Breaker Sun, which is my small collection from PM Press, which includes a novella, The Planet Breaker Sun, another short story, The Term Paper Artist, and an interview with me, with Terry Bisson, who is the series editor. And this series has had like Kim Stanley Robinson, Ursula K. Le Guin, Joe Lansdale, a lot of famous people, and then there's also me.
And you can find it in the links in the bottom of this YouTube video.
Absolutely.
Check down there.
They really do.
Technology, right?
Yeah, so when I moved to California to get my job in publishing, I gave up term paper writing, and they actually owed me some money. And the guy was like, "I'm not giving you that money. I'm in Thailand. Try to get it." I'm like, "Okay, I think I know a way to get this money." And so I wrote The Term Paper Artist, sort of blowing the lid off the industry. And it got published, and it got me on NPR. I was called a whore on NPR.
Well, that's who called you a whore on NPR?
The guy who was recently fired. His show was On the Media, and he got recently fired just some months ago for yelling at staff members and like being obnoxious generally. So in fact, he was obnoxious on air too.
Huh.
And we were talking about he was really upset, as most people try to pretend to be upset. "Oh, you term papers, why? How dare you? What if it's a nurse?" Like, nurses did hire me, but not for nursing. They hired me for poetry classes.
Right.
They were good at nursing. A lot of them were Russian immigrants who were highly credentialed in Russia, but that credentials to carry over, so they have to drive a cab and go back to school to learn the same thing they learned. But now we want them to learn about Edgar Allan Poe as well.
Yeah, it makes no sense, but yeah.
So you may as well farm that out, right? And of course, a lot of business students hired me because what do you learn in business school? Hire your weaknesses. Right? You went to business school, didn't they teach you that?
Yeah, but some people have some students have integrity. Others are. Look, you're just meeting the needs of the market, right? There's an unmet need in the market that you're meeting. That's one thing. It's the people who.
Not even think it should be illegal. It's called the Constitution, First Amendment, freedom of speech.
That's right. And you're not selling them with the intent for them to use them in their courses. You're just writing model papers.
If they're committing fraud, that's their problem.
Yeah.
And who are they defrauding but themselves?
That's right. Well, they're also defrauding people who might get lower grades because you're a better writer than many of the people that would be in those classes. So
that'll be a good class action suit one day. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's just and then you'll have your little trademark inside each of the.
Oh yeah, there were things were watermarked, and of course, I would put in stuff that would sort of signal it was to a smart grad student or a smart professor that something else is going on here. But so I was on. So this came out in the magazine, The Smart Set, an online magazine run by Drexel University, $400. So that made up some money, and it sold again to a couple of textbooks for freshman composition. So as if to let the kids know, we're on to you. We know about this term paper business. And textbooks pay really well because what is the circulation of a textbook?
Yep. Well, I mean, I don't know what the number is, but I know that you have a captive audience, so to speak. Right?
Exactly.
You must buy this textbook.
Yeah. And not just one class, but dozens of classrooms, hundreds of classrooms use it across the country every year.
So when were you interviewed by NPR? Like what year?
2008, when the essay came out.
I wonder if
that's viral.
I wonder if that's still up.
It is still up. Okay. This is a better interview, by the way. You're already better than this guy who worked with NPR. You're doing great on your second YouTube.